The bell above Brennan's Hardware hadn't changed its tune in 15 years. Same off-key chime that used to announce my arrival after school, when I'd find Dad behind the counter, pencil tucked behind his ear, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Now it announced customers to me, and I'd look up from the same counter, wearing the same expression of patient expectation he used to wear. Most days I knew who was coming through that door before they finished opening it. Mrs. Chen needed more birdseed. Tom Fletcher was back for another bag of rock salt. His driveway had been a losing battle against winter for 3 decades running. The Hendersons would shuffle in together, arguing quietly about whether they needed wood stain or wood polish, and I'd listen to them debate for 20 minutes before suggesting they buy both. I knew the rhythm of this place, the predictable pulse of a town that had settled into itself long ago, content to let the world rush past while we kept time with the seasons and the slow turn of familiar faces through familiar routines. That's why the silence felt so wrong that Tuesday afternoon in March. I was reorganizing the paint display, a task that didn't need doing but kept my hands busy during the slow hours, when the bell chimed. I looked up with my standard greeting ready, and the words died somewhere between my throat and my tongue. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the pale afternoon sun, and for a moment I thought I was seeing things, a ghost, maybe. A memory that had somehow pulled itself loose and wandered into the present. But ghosts don't fill doorways the way Caleb Rivers did, don't stand with that particular weight to their shoulders, like they're carrying something heavier than bone and muscle, don't have scars cutting thin white lines across their knuckles, or eyes that seem to take in everything while revealing nothing. He was taller than I remembered, broader. The boy who used to live next door had been replaced by a man who looked like he'd been carved from something harder than the soft pine hills that surrounded our town. His dark hair was shorter now, military short, and there were new lines around his green eyes that hadn't been there when he left. But when those eyes met mine across the narrow aisles of hardware and paint cans, it was like stepping back in time and forward into some unknown future all at once. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The air conditioning unit kicked on with a mechanical wheeze, and somewhere in the back of the store, a loose board creaked under its own weight. Normal sounds of a normal afternoon, but they felt amplified, like the silence between us was its own living thing. "Jesse," he said finally, and my name sounded different in his voice, rougher, careful, like he wasn't sure he had the right to say it. "Caleb." I set down the paint can I'd been holding, realized my hands were shaking slightly, and shoved them into my pockets. "When did you get back?" "Last week." "For good?" Something flickered across his expression. "That's the plan." Another silence. I wanted to ask him 100 questions. Where he'd been, what he'd seen, why he'd never called, never wrote, never gave any of us a way to know if he was alive or dead for the past 4 years. But the questions felt too big for the space between us, too heavy for a Tuesday afternoon conversation between two people who used to know everything about each other and now knew nothing at all. "You need something?" I asked instead, because it was easier than anything else I might have said. Just looking around. He took a step further into the store, and I noticed the way he moved, controlled, economical, like every gesture was something he'd thought about first. "Haven't been in here since—" He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to, since before he left, since the summer after graduation, when everything between us had been teetering on the edge of something we were both too afraid to name. I watched him move through the aisles, touching things lightly, a display of wrenches, a coil of rope, a stack of lumber catalogs. His fingers lingered on familiar objects like he was relearning them, or maybe like he was making sure they were real. "Your dad would have been glad to see you back," I said, because someone needed to fill the quiet and because it was true. Caleb's hand stilled on a box of nails. "I heard about yours. I'm sorry I wasn't here for the funeral." The words hit me sideways. Dad had been gone 2 years now, and most people had stopped mentioning it, stopped giving me those careful, sympathetic looks that said they remembered I was the kid who'd lost his father too young, who'd inherited a hardware store and a mortgage and the responsibility of keeping a piece of the town's history alive. But Caleb said it like the loss was still fresh. like he understood what it meant to come home to a place that had been carved hollow by absence. "He always liked you," I said. It was easier than saying thank you, easier than acknowledging the way my chest had tightened at his words. Even after, especially after, I met his eyes again. He never blamed you for leaving, said everyone should get the chance to see what else is out there. And what did you think? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 4 years of silence and all the things we'd never said to each other. I thought about lying, about giving him some easy answer that would keep us in safe territory, keep us talking about hardware and weather and anything except the truth. Instead, I said, "I thought you were braver than the rest of us." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or recognition. For just a moment, he looked like the boy I remembered, the one who used to climb through my bedroom window when his parents were fighting, who taught me how to drive stick shift in the empty parking lot behind the high school, who used to talk about leaving town like it was something magical instead of something necessary. But then he looked away and the moment passed. "I should let you get back to work," he said. "Caleb." The word came out before I could stop it. He paused near the door, half turned toward me. "It's good to see you." He nodded once, quick and sharp, and then he was gone. The bell chimed his departure, and I was alone again with the familiar quiet of the store and the taste of his name still lingering on my tongue. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the door and trying to figure out what had just happened. Trying to reconcile the memory of the boy I'd known with the reality of the man who'd walked into my store and looked at me like I was something he wasn't sure he should remember. Everyone in town had been talking about Caleb Rivers coming home, the local hero back from serving his country, the success story, the boy who'd made something of himself out there in the wide world before returning to claim his place among us. But they were wrong about what I'd seen in him that afternoon. They saw a soldier. I saw the boy who used to wait for me after school lean against his truck with one ankle crossed over the other and say nothing when he didn't have to, who could communicate whole conversations with just the tilt of his head or the lift of his shoulders, the boy who had broken my heart without ever knowing he'd held it. 3 days later, I found myself standing on the Rivers family's front porch with a toolbox in one hand and a coil of extension cord in the other. Mrs. Rivers had called the store that morning, asking if I could bring by the cord she'd ordered and maybe take a look at the electrical outlet on their back deck that had been acting up. "Caleb's been trying to fix it," she'd said, and I could hear the worry in her voice even over the phone. "But I don't think, he's been back a week now and he's been so quiet. Maybe if you came by." She didn't finish the thought, but I understood. Caleb's mother had always been good at reading between the lines, at seeing what people needed even when they couldn't ask for it directly. If she thought her son needed company, she was probably right. The house looked the same as it always had. White clapboard siding, green shutters, the big oak tree in the front yard that Caleb and I used to climb when we were kids. Mrs. Rivers answered the door with flour on her hands and that same warm smile she'd been giving me since I was 8 years old. "Jesse, honey, thank you for coming by." She took the extension cord and ushered me inside, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the lingering scent of coffee and something else, something that spoke of a house that was trying to remember how to be a home again. "He's out back working on the fence, been at it all morning." I made my way through the kitchen and out the back door, following the sound of a hammer striking wood in steady rhythmic beats. The backyard was bigger than I remembered, stretching down toward the tree line that marked the boundary between the Rivers property and the state land beyond. Caleb was at the far end, near where the old fence separated their yard from the Hendricks place next door. He had his back to me, and I took a moment to watch him work. His t-shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool March air, and I could see the muscles in his shoulders and arms moving under the fabric as he drove nails into the fence posts with precise, economical strikes. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, focused, methodical, like the repetition of the task was providing something he needed. He must have heard my footsteps on the grass because he stopped mid-swing and turned around. For a second, something like wariness flickered across his face, but then he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt. "Your mom asked me to take a look at the outlet," I said, gesturing toward the deck. "It's been shorting out," he said. "Probably needs rewiring." You still remember how to fix that? The question came out lighter than I'd intended, almost teasing, and I saw something in his expression ease slightly. You think I forgot this place? There was something in the way he said it, not defensive exactly, but weighted with meaning I couldn't quite parse, like the question had layers I wasn't seeing. No, I said. I don't think you could forget this place if you tried. He looked at me for a long moment, then set his hammer down on the nearest fence post. Want to help? I've got another hammer somewhere. It should have been awkward. 4 years of silence, 4 years of wondering, and here we were, working on a fence like no time had passed at all. But there was something familiar about the rhythm of working alongside him, the way we fell into sync without needing to discuss who would do what. He held the board steady while I drove the nails. I handed him tools without being asked. When we needed to move to the next section, we did it in the kind of wordless coordination that comes from years of shared experience, from knowing someone well enough to anticipate their movements. The sun climbed higher as we worked, and I found myself stealing glances at him when I thought he wasn't looking. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. The way he carried himself, the careful control in every movement, the way his eyes seemed to be constantly assessing, cataloging, watching for things that probably weren't there. He walked like someone who had learned not to take up space. But when he looked at me, he still looked like he used to, direct, unguarded, like I was worth his full attention. We were working on a section near the back corner of the yard when our arms brushed as we both reached for the same board. It was barely contact, the whisper of skin against skin, there and gone in an instant. But Caleb pulled back like he'd been burned, and I saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like panic before he got it under control. Sorry, he muttered, and busied himself sorting through the pile of nails. It's fine, I said, but the moment had shifted something between us, made the air feel charged, heavy with the weight of all the things we weren't saying. We worked in silence for a while after that, the easy rhythm broken. I wanted to ask him about it, about the way he'd reacted, about what he'd seen in whatever war zone the military had sent him to, about why he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But I didn't know how to bridge the gap between the boy I'd known and the man working beside me, didn't know what questions I had the right to ask. Instead, I said, "You planning to stay? Really?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I don't have anywhere else to go." It wasn't the answer I'd expected. Caleb had always talked about leaving town like it was inevitable, like staying was a kind of failure. The idea that he might be back because he had no other options, not because he wanted to be here, settled heavy in my chest. "This town's not so bad," I said. "Once you remember how it works." "That's what I'm afraid of." He looked up at me then, and there was something raw in his expression that made my breath catch. "I'm not the same person who left, Jesse. I don't know if I can be who this place expects me to be." "Who says you have to be?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He set down his hammer and really looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time since he'd walked into the hardware store. "Everyone in town thinks they know what I did over there," he said quietly. "They see the uniform and they think they know the story. They want me to be some kind of hero. And what do you want to be?" "I want to be someone who can sleep through the night without checking the locks twice. Someone who doesn't flinch when a car backfires. Someone who can stand in a crowd without needing to know where all the exits are." He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused from work I couldn't even imagine. "I want to be someone who belongs somewhere again." The honesty in his voice hit me like a physical thing. I wanted to tell him that he did belong here, that he'd always belonged here, but the words felt too small for what he was sharing with me. Instead, I said, "The Jesse who knew you before, he's not the same person either." "No?" "No." I thought about how to explain it. The way Dad's death had changed me, the way running the store had settled something in me that I hadn't even known was restless, the way the past 4 years had taught me things about solitude and responsibility and the weight of keeping other people's needs ahead of your own. People change, places change, doesn't mean they can't still fit together. He was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd said too much. if I'd pushed into territory we weren't ready to explore. But then he picked up his hammer again and said, "Help me finish this section?" We worked until the sun started to sink toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded me of every sunset I'd watched from this same spot when we were kids. When the last nail was driven and the last board secured, we stood back to admire our work. "Looks good," I said. "Yeah." Caleb wiped his hands on the rag again. "Thanks for the help." "Any time." I meant it, and I think he knew I did. There was something different in the way he looked at me as I gathered up my tools, something that reminded me of the boy who used to climb through my bedroom window and tell me things he couldn't tell anyone else. "Jesse," he said as I was heading back toward the house. "Yeah? It's good to see you, too." The words were simple, an echo of what I'd said to him in the hardware store, but they felt like something more, like the first step across a bridge we'd both been afraid to build. I smiled and headed back through the house, said goodbye to Mrs. Rivers, and drove home through streets that felt somehow different than they had that morning, like the town was shifting around me, rearranging itself to make room for the possibility that some things could be reclaimed, that some distances could be crossed. That night, I lay in bed in the house my father had left me and thought about Caleb Rivers, about the boy who used to wait for me after school and the man who'd pulled back from my touch like it might burn him, about the way he'd looked when he talked about wanting to belong somewhere again, and the way something in my chest had recognized that longing like an echo of my own. I thought about the summer after graduation, about the night everything had almost changed between us, about the way he'd looked at me in the cab of his truck, parked by the lake with the windows down and the sound of cicadas filling the warm air, about how close we'd come to crossing a line that might have changed everything, and how we'd both pulled back at the last second, too afraid of what it might mean, about how he'd left 3 days later without saying goodbye. Now he was back, and I could see the weight he was carrying in the careful way he moved, in the way he startled at sudden sounds, in the way he held himself like he was always ready for something to go wrong. Everyone saw a soldier. I saw the boy who used to wait for me after school lean against his truck and say nothing when he didn't have to. The question was whether whatever we'd been to each other could survive who we'd become. The Founders Day Festival was one of those small-town traditions that nobody particularly loved, but everyone attended anyway. Every year, the town council strung lights between the oak trees in the park. Local businesses set up booths selling everything from kettle corn to handmade quilts, and someone inevitably got too drunk on beer and nostalgia and started a fight that would be talked about until next year's festival provided a new scandal to replace it. I usually worked the hardware store's booth, selling small items and answering questions about home repair projects that people had been putting off all year. It was good business and gave me something to do with my hands while I watched the familiar rhythms of the town play out around me. This year felt different, though. There was an undercurrent of anticipation that I couldn't quite identify, conversations that stopped when I walked by, glances that lingered a little too long. It took me longer than it should have to realize that everyone was waiting to see Caleb, the local hero, making his first public appearance since coming home. I'd been at my booth for about an hour making small talk with customers and trying not to scan the crowd for a familiar figure when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the festival, near the old gazebo that had been decorated with red, white, and blue bunting for the occasion. Even at a distance, I could see the tension in his posture, the way he held himself slightly apart from the flow of people around him. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a plain gray t-shirt, but somehow he still looked like he was in uniform. There was something about the way he stood, the way his eyes moved constantly over the crowd that set him apart from everyone else. People noticed him, of course. I watched as heads turned in his direction, as conversation shifted to include speculation about when he'd make his way deeper into the festival, as parents pointed him out to their children with pride and something that looked like reverence. But Caleb didn't seem to notice any of it. His attention was focused across the crowd, and when I followed his gaze, I realized he was looking at me. Our eyes met over the heads of families and couples and groups of teenagers, over the booths selling crafts and food and local honey. The distance between us felt both infinite and non-existent, like we were the only two people in the world, and also like we were separated by an ocean. He didn't look away, and neither did I. There was something in his expression that reminded me of that night by the lake, something that made my pulse quicken and my hands go still on the wrench display I'd been arranging. Jesse? I turned to find Tom Fletcher standing at my booth, holding a receipt and looking confused. Sorry, what? I asked if you had any more of those weatherproof hinges, the ones I bought last month. Right, sorry. I turned my attention back to the customer, made the sale, answered his questions about installation. But when I looked back toward the gazebo, Caleb was gone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of familiar faces and routine interactions. I sold a surprising amount of merchandise, answered questions about storm windows and gutter cleaning, and managed to avoid the worst of the crowd by closing up my booth early. I was loading the last of the unsold items into my truck when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Need help? I turned to find Caleb standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain. The festival was winding down around us, families packing up their picnic blankets and teenagers reluctantly heading home before curfew. The lights strung between the trees cast everything in a warm, golden glow that made the moment feel suspended, separate from real time. I'm about done, I said, but thanks. He nodded and we stood there for a moment, not quite looking at each other. The silence stretched between us, comfortable and awkward at the same time. How was it? I asked finally. Your first town event since being back? Loud, he said, and there was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. Lot of people. Yeah, it gets pretty crowded. You okay? He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he did speak, his voice was quiet enough that I had to step closer to hear him. I kept thinking something was going to happen, he said. Some kind of trouble. Couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be ready for it. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way that made my chest tighten. I thought about what he'd said while we were working on the fence, about wanting to be someone who could stand in a crowd without needing to know where all the exits were. But nothing happened, I said. No, nothing happened. He looked up at me then, and in the festival lights I could see something that looked like surprise in his expression. It was just a town festival. Sometimes the biggest victories are the quiet ones. The words came out before I'd really thought them through, but as soon as I said them, I knew they were true. Not just for Caleb, but for all of us. For everyone who'd ever had to relearn how to exist in a world that felt different than the one they'd left behind. Is that what this was? He asked. A victory? Maybe. You stayed. You didn't leave when it got uncomfortable. That's something. He was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Less weighted somehow, like something had loosened in him. Want to get out of here? He asked suddenly. Go somewhere quieter? The question caught me off guard. Not because I didn't want to. I'd wanted to spend time with him since he'd walked into my store a week ago. But because it felt like a step towards something I wasn't sure either of us was ready for. Where did you have in mind? Remember that spot by the lake? Where we used to go when we needed to get away from everything? I remembered. Of course I remembered. It was the same place where we'd almost kissed that summer night 4 years ago, where everything between us had balanced on the edge of becoming something different, and then pulled back at the last second. But I nodded anyway because some conversations couldn't happen in town, surrounded by the weight of other people's expectations and assumptions. Some things needed space and privacy and the kind of darkness that let you say what you really meant. I'll meet you there, I said. The drive to the lake took 15 minutes through back roads that I could navigate with my eyes closed. I'd grown up on these roads, learned to drive on the winding stretches that curved between farms and forests, spent countless teenage evenings racing along the gravel paths that led to swimming holes and makeout spots and places where you could park and look up at more stars than seemed possible. The spot Caleb had mentioned was at the end of a dirt road that branched off from the main lake access, a small clearing that overlooked the water through a gap in the trees. We discovered it during the summer before our junior year of high school, and it had become our place, somewhere to go when we needed to escape the suffocating attention of a small town, when we needed to talk about things that felt too big for bedroom conversations. His truck was already there when I arrived, parked in the shadow of the pine trees that surrounded the clearing. I could see him sitting on the tailgate, silhouetted against the water that caught the moonlight like scattered silver. I parked beside him and got out, the sound of my truck door closing unnaturally loud in the quiet. The air smelled like pine needles and lake water, exactly the way it always had. Some things, at least, hadn't changed. "Thanks for coming," he said as I walked over to where he was sitting. "Thanks for asking." I hoisted myself up onto the tailgate beside him, leaving a careful distance between us, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. For a few minutes, we just sat there, looking out at the water and letting the familiar peace of the place settle around us. "I used to dream about this spot," he said eventually. "When I was overseas, when things got difficult, I'd close my eyes and try to remember exactly what it looked like. The way the moonlight hits the water, the sound the wind makes in the trees." "Did it help?" "Sometimes." He was quiet for a moment. "Other times it made it worse, made me homesick for something I wasn't sure existed anymore." "What do you mean?" He turned to look at me then, and in the moonlight his face was all shadows and angles, familiar and strange at the same time. "I mean the boy who used to come here with you. The one who thought he knew who he was and where he belonged. I wasn't sure he'd still be here when I got back." The words hit me like a physical thing, settling heavy in my chest. I thought about how to respond, how to tell him that the boy he'd known was still here but changed, evolved, marked by the same kind of time and experience that had changed him. "He's here," I said finally. "Different, maybe, but here." "Yeah?" "Yeah." I looked out at the water, at the way the moonlight fractured on the surface into 1,000 moving pieces. "You want to know what I used to think about when you were gone?" He nodded. "I used to think about that summer, before you left, about how close we came to—" I stopped, suddenly uncertain. 4 years of silence had built walls between us, and I wasn't sure I had the right to mention what had almost happened. "To what?" His voice was soft, careful. "You know what?" Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "I think about it too, all the time." The admission hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift in my chest. A loosening, like a knot I'd been carrying for 4 years had suddenly started to unravel. "Why did you leave?" The question came out before I could stop it, before I could think about whether I really wanted to know the answer. "I mean, I know why you left town, but why did you leave like that, without saying goodbye?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he did, his voice was rough with something that sounded like regret. "Because I was scared," he said. "Because that night in the truck when we almost— I wanted it so much it terrified me. And I didn't know what that meant, didn't know how to be that person in a place like this, so I ran. And now? Now I'm not sure I have the luxury of running anymore." He looked at me, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made my breath catch. "Now I'm just trying to figure out how to be myself in the only place that's ever felt like home." I wanted to tell him that he didn't have to figure it out alone, that whatever he'd seen, whatever he'd done, whatever weight he was carrying, it didn't change the fundamental truth of who he was. That the boy who used to climb through my bedroom window and tell me things he couldn't tell anyone else was still there, still worth knowing, still worth whatever risk came with letting him back into my life. But the words felt too big, too heavy with possibility and fear and 4 years of accumulated longing. So instead I said, "You don't have to be anyone but yourself, Caleb. Not for this town, not for anyone. And if myself isn't someone you recognize anymore?" The question was quiet, almost lost in the sound of wind moving through the trees, but I heard it, heard the fear underneath it, the uncertainty that had been living in the space between us since he'd walked into my store. "Then I guess we'll figure out who you are now," I said. "Together, if you want." He turned to look at me then, really look at me. And for a moment, it was like being 17 again, sitting in this same spot and feeling the weight of possibility hanging in the air between us. But this time, instead of pulling back, instead of letting fear make the decision for us, he reached out. His fingers found mine in the space between us on the tailgate, rough and warm and real. Not quite holding hands, but touching, a bridge across 4 years of silence and change and all the things we'd never said to each other. "I'd like that," he said. We sat there for a long time after that, not saying much, just existing in the same space and letting the familiar piece of the lake work its way into the conversation. It wasn't everything. There were still questions to ask, wounds to tend, distances to bridge, but it was a beginning. A recognition that whatever we'd been to each other might be worth rebuilding, worth the risk of discovering what we could become. When we finally left, driving back through the dark roads toward town, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 4 years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind that comes from wanting things to be different, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from believing they actually could be. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Caleb would stop by the hardware store every few days, sometimes with a specific need, screws for a project, advice about rewiring something in his parents' house, but more often just to talk. We'd discuss the weather, the town gossip, the changes that had happened while he was gone. Surface-level conversations that slowly deepened as we relearned how to be comfortable with each other. He was different than he'd been before he left, but then again, so was I. The easy intimacy of our teenage friendship had been replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. We were adults now, with adult responsibilities and adult fears, and we both seemed to understand that whatever relationship we built would have to account for who we'd become, not just who we'd been. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the boy I'd known, in the way he laughed at something I said or the way he tilted his head when he was thinking through a problem. But more often I was learning to appreciate the man he'd become, the deliberate way he approached decisions, the quiet competence he brought to any task, the way he listened with his full attention when someone was talking to him. It should have been awkward, this careful dance of rediscovery, but somehow it wasn't. Maybe because we'd both grown into ourselves in the years apart. Maybe because we both understood what we'd almost lost when we let fear make our decisions for us. Or maybe because some connections are strong enough to survive time and distance and change, deep enough that they can be trusted to guide you back to each other even when the path isn't clear. I was thinking about this on a Thursday evening in mid-April as I locked up the store. The spring air was warm and sweet with the smell of blooming trees, and I was looking forward to getting home, maybe grilling something simple for dinner and spending the evening on my back porch with a book and a beer. I was testing the lock on the front door when I heard footsteps behind me on the sidewalk. "You still close up alone?" I turned to find Caleb standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain in the way he'd been looking less and less often lately. There was something different about him tonight, something that reminded me of the boy who used to wait for me after school, unsure if he was welcome but hoping anyway. "No one ever applied for the job," I said, echoing the conversation we'd had in this same spot weeks ago. A pause, the kind of silence that felt full of things waiting to be said. "I used to think I'd come back and this place would feel smaller," he said, his voice quiet in the evening air. "And does it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the way he was looking at me. "No," he said. "It's just quieter now." Another pause, longer this time. The street was empty, most of the shops closed for the evening, and it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Like this moment existed outside of normal time, suspended in the space between one breath and the next. "I remember what you said," he added suddenly. "About what?" "About leaving." The words hit me like a physical thing, and suddenly I was 17 again, sitting in his truck in the parking lot behind the high school, talking about our plans for after graduation. I'd been the one to say at first that I couldn't imagine leaving this town, couldn't imagine building a life anywhere else. And he'd looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language, like the idea of staying was something he couldn't even comprehend. Now, here we were, both of us exactly where we'd started, but somehow everything had changed. Our eyes met across the distance between us, 3 feet of sidewalk that felt like an ocean and a hair's breadth at the same time. I could see something building in his expression, something that looked like the kind of courage it takes to jump off a cliff when you're not sure if you can fly. "Jesse," he said, and my name sounded different in his voice than it had in weeks. Less careful, more like it used to sound when we were kids, and he'd say it like it was something precious. But before he could finish whatever thought was building between us, a car turned onto Main Street, its headlights sweeping across us and breaking the moment. We both stepped back instinctively, and the spell was broken. "I should let you get home," he said, but his voice carried a question. "Yeah," I said, though what I wanted was to ask him to stay, to keep talking until we'd said all the things we'd been avoiding for weeks. "I should." But neither of us moved. We stood there in the space between decision and action, both of us knowing that something had shifted, but neither quite ready to name it. Finally, Caleb took a step back. "See you around, Jesse." "See you." I watched him walk away, hands in his pockets, shoulders set with the same careful control he'd been carrying since he came home. When his footsteps faded into the quiet of the evening, I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty street and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Something was building between us, something that felt both inevitable and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you wanted to jump. The question was whether we'd have the courage to let it. Part 2. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear Caleb's voice saying my name, could see the look in his eyes when he'd mentioned leaving. By morning, I felt like I'd been turned inside out, every nerve ending exposed and raw. The store was busy enough to keep me distracted through most of the day, but by afternoon, the familiar rhythm of inventory and customer service felt mechanical, like I was moving through water. I kept thinking about the way the moment had felt suspended between us on the sidewalk, heavy with possibility and old history. I was pricing a new shipment of paint when the bell chimed, and I looked up to see Caleb standing in the doorway. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. There were shadows under his eyes, and his usual careful composure seemed frayed around the edges. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He walked over to the counter, moving with that deliberate control that had become familiar over the past few weeks. But there was something different about him today, something that reminded me of the boy who used to pace my bedroom when he was working up the courage to say something important. "I was wondering," he said, then stopped, started again. "My mom's been after me to clean out the attic. All my old stuff is still up there from before I left. I was thinking maybe, if you had time this weekend. You want help?" "I want the company," he said, and the honesty in his voice made something in my chest tighten. "If you don't mind dust and whatever else has been living up there for 4 years." "I don't mind dust." "Saturday morning?" "I'll be there." Something eased in his expression, like he'd been holding his breath. "Thanks, Jesse." After he left, I stood behind the counter and tried to figure out what I'd just agreed to, spending a day in close quarters with Caleb, going through the remnants of his life before everything changed. It felt like volunteering to walk through a minefield, but I'd said yes anyway. Because the truth was, I wanted to understand him. The boy he'd been and the man he'd become, and all the places where those two versions of himself overlapped or diverged. And maybe, if I was being honest with myself, I wanted him to understand me too. Saturday morning arrived gray and cool, with the kind of overcast sky that promised rain later in the day. I drove to the Rivers house with a thermos of coffee and a sense of anticipation that felt both familiar and foreign. Mrs. Rivers let me in with the same warm smile she'd been giving me for 20 years, but I could see the worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before Caleb left. Having her son home should have been a relief, but I was beginning to understand that some kinds of homecoming were more complicated than others. "He's upstairs already," she said, gesturing toward the ceiling where I could hear the sound of boxes being moved around. "I swear that boy has been up there since dawn, making enough noise to wake the dead." I found Caleb in the attic, surrounded by cardboard boxes and covered in dust. He'd opened the small window at the far end of the space, but the air was still thick and warm, heavy with the smell of old wood and forgotten things. Looks like you started without me, I said. Couldn't sleep. He straightened up from the box he'd been sorting through, wiping his hands on his jeans. Figured I might as well be productive with the insomnia. There was something raw in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. He was wearing an old t-shirt that I recognized from high school, faded and soft with age, and there were smudges of dust on his cheek that made him look younger somehow. Bad night? I asked. They're all bad nights, he said, then seemed to catch himself. Sorry, I don't mean to. You don't have to apologize for having bad nights, Caleb. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing whether to say more. Finally, he gestured to the boxes around us. Help me make sense of this mess? We fell into a rhythm quickly. Most of the boxes were clearly labeled, clothes, books, school papers, but their contents told the story of a boy I'd known and forgotten I'd known. Report cards with grades that had made his parents proud, trophies from Little League and high school track, CDs we'd listened to until we wore them out, driving around town with the windows down and the music loud enough to drown out everything else. In one box, I found a collection of notebooks filled with his handwriting. Song lyrics, mostly, and fragments of poetry that made me remember how he used to talk about maybe writing music someday, maybe trying to make something beautiful out of all the restless energy that never seemed to find an outlet in a town this small. I forgot you used to write, I said, holding up one of the notebooks. I forgot, too. He took it from me, flipping through pages that looked impossibly young. Seems like a different lifetime. Do you still? Write? He shook his head. Hard to find anything worth writing about when you're just trying to get through each day. There was something so sad in the way he said it that I had to look away. I wanted to tell him that survival was worth writing about, that making it home was worth writing about, that learning how to exist in your own skin again was worth writing about. But I didn't know if he was ready to hear that yet. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, sorting through the archaeological layers of his teenage years. It was strange seeing pieces of our shared history from his perspective. Ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together, programs from school plays we'd both been dragged to, photos of group outings that I'd forgotten but that he'd apparently considered worth keeping. I was deep in a box of old textbooks when my fingers found something that made me go still. It was a strip of photo booth pictures, the kind you could get at the mall in the machine that charged you $5 for 4 tiny black and white shots. The images were faded but clear enough. Caleb and me, probably 17 years old, grinning at the camera with the kind of uninhibited joy that seems impossible in hindsight. In the first photo, we were both making faces at the camera. In the second, Caleb was laughing at something I'd said, his head thrown back and his eyes crinkled with amusement. In the third, we were looking at each other instead of the camera, and there was something in our expressions that made my chest tighten with recognition. In the fourth, we were closer than we'd been in the others, my head tilted toward his, both of us looking directly at the camera with soft, serious expressions that looked like we were sharing a secret. I stared at the photos for a long moment, remembering the day we'd taken them. It had been during our senior year, a random Saturday when we'd driven to the mall in the next town over just because we were bored and restless and couldn't think of anything else to do. I remembered how Caleb had dared me to get in the photo booth with him, how we'd been laughing so hard we could barely keep still for the camera. What I hadn't remembered, until this moment, was how it had felt to be pressed close to him in that tiny booth, how aware I'd been of the warmth of his shoulder against mine, how something had shifted in the air between us during those 4 quick flashes of light. Find something interesting? I looked up to find Caleb watching me and realized I'd been staring at the photos for longer than I'd intended. I held up the strip without saying anything and watched as recognition flickered across his face. He came over and knelt beside the box I was sorting through, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his soap mixed with dust and old wood. He took the photos from me with careful fingers, studying them like they were archaeological artifacts. God, we were young, he said quietly. Yeah, I remember this day. You made me go to Spencer's afterward and buy that ridiculous skull keychain. You loved that keychain? I did. He was still looking at the photos, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read. I took it with me when I left, kept it on my keys the whole time I was deployed. The admission hung in the air between us, simple and profound. I thought about Caleb carrying this piece of our shared history with him through whatever experiences had put those new lines around his eyes, whatever had taught him to move like he was always ready for trouble. What happened to it? I asked. Lost it somewhere along the way. He looked up at me then, and there was something raw in his expression. A lot of things got lost. We sat there in the dusty attic, surrounded by boxes full of who we used to be, and I felt the weight of all the time that had passed between us, all the things that had happened while we were apart, all the ways we'd both changed and grown and been broken and put ourselves back together. But I also felt something else, the pull of connection that had always existed between us, stronger now for having survived the distance and time and silence. Looking at those photos, I could see the thread that connected the boys we'd been to the men we were now, could feel the way some things endure even when everything else changes. Caleb set the photos carefully on top of a nearby box, handling them like they were made of something more fragile than paper. Then he went back to sorting through his things, and we didn't talk about them again. But I knew he'd keep them, just like I knew I'd think about them later when I was alone. Some moments are worth preserving, worth carrying with you even when, especially when they remind you of what you've lost. We worked through lunch, sustained by sandwiches that Mrs. Rivers brought up and the kind of easy conversation that comes when your hands are busy and your defenses are down. Caleb told me about the letters his mother had sent him while he was deployed, full of town gossip and weather reports and careful questions about when he might be coming home. I told him about the renovations I'd been making to my father's house, the slow process of making it feel like mine instead of his. It was the kind of conversation we might have had when we were teenagers, comfortable and meandering, touching on serious things without dwelling on them. But underneath it, I could feel the weight of everything we weren't saying, all the questions we weren't quite ready to ask. By late afternoon, we'd made significant progress. The attic was beginning to look organized instead of chaotic, with clear piles for things to keep, things to donate, and things that belonged in the trash. Caleb had been quiet for the past hour, sorting through a box of papers with more attention than they seemed to warrant. "What's in there?" I asked. "Letters," he said without looking up. "From basic training, from overseas." He pulled out a handful of envelopes, yellowed with age and soft from handling. I could see familiar return addresses, his parents, a few other people from town, and some that were unfamiliar, probably from people he'd met in the military. "Must be strange, reading them now," I said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "There were nights over there I thought about this street, about your porch light, dumb things." The words were so quiet I almost didn't catch them, but they hit me with unexpected force. The idea that he'd been thinking about home, about my home specifically, while he was somewhere I couldn't even imagine. "It's not dumb," I said. "Didn't feel like it." He looked up at me then, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made my breath catch. Felt like the only real things in the world. I didn't know what to say to that. How do you respond when someone tells you that the thought of your porch light kept them grounded in a war zone? How do you carry that kind of responsibility, that kind of unintended significance? Instead of trying to find words, I moved closer to where he was sitting, close enough that our shoulders were almost touching. It was a small gesture, but it felt enormous in the dusty quiet of the attic. "You made it home," I said finally. "Most of me." The words were barely more than a whisper, but they carried the weight of everything he'd been trying not to say since he came back. I wanted to ask what parts of him had been left behind, wanted to offer to help him find them or build new ones to replace them. But I could see in his posture that he wasn't ready for those questions yet. So instead I said, "The parts that made it are the ones that matter." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment the careful distance he'd been maintaining crumbled. I could see the boy I'd known in his expression, but also the man he'd become, and all the complicated places where those two versions of himself intersected. "How do you do that?" he asked. Do what? Make it sound simple. Maybe because it is simple, I said. Not easy, but simple. You're here, you're home. The rest we can figure out. Something shifted in his expression, like he was hearing something he hadn't expected to hear. He was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me, and I felt the air in the attic grow thick with possibility. But then a car door slammed somewhere outside, breaking the moment, and we both pulled back slightly. The spell was broken, but something had changed between us. Some wall had been lowered, some distance closed. We finished sorting through the last few boxes as the afternoon light began to fade, working with the kind of efficiency that comes when you're both aware that time is running out. By the time we carried the last box of donations down to the garage, the sky was beginning to turn the deep blue that meant evening was coming. Thank you, Caleb said as we stood in his parents' driveway, both of us dusty and tired, but somehow lighter than we'd been that morning. I don't think I could have done that alone. You don't have to do everything alone, I said, and meant it. I'm still learning that. I wanted to tell him that he had time, that learning to accept help was a process, that no one expected him to have all the answers right away, but instead I just nodded because sometimes the most important conversations happen in the spaces between words. As I was getting into my truck, Caleb called my name. I turned to see him standing in the golden light from his parents' porch, looking uncertain in the way he'd been looking less and less often lately. Jesse, he said, then stopped, started again. Would you want to, if you're not doing anything tomorrow? What did you have in mind? Remember that hill we used to climb, the one on the old Peterson property? I was thinking maybe we could. He trailed off, looking almost embarrassed by the suggestion. Like old times? Something like that. I thought about it for maybe half a second. Pick me up at 10? The smile that spread across his face was the first completely unguarded one I'd seen since he came home. 10 it is. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that makes you understand why people write songs about small towns in spring. I was waiting on my front porch when Caleb's truck pulled into my driveway, 2 cups of coffee and a cardboard carrier on the passenger seat and an ease in his expression that I hadn't seen in weeks. Thought you might need caffeine for the hike, he said when I climbed into the cab. You remembered how I take it? Black 2 sugars, some things you don't forget. The drive to the Peterson property took us through the heart of the county, past farms and forests and stretches of road that hadn't changed since we were kids. We talked about inconsequential things, the weather, the spring planting season, Mrs. Chen's ongoing battle with the deer eating her garden, but underneath the easy conversation I could feel the anticipation building. The hill had been our place when we were younger, before we discovered the lake spot, before we needed somewhere to escape to that felt completely private. It was just high enough to give you a view of the valley below, just secluded enough that you could spend hours there without seeing another person. The trail up was overgrown now, 4 years of neglect having allowed the underbrush to reclaim what had once been a clear path. We had to push through tangles of brambles and step over fallen logs, but our feet seemed to remember the way even when our eyes couldn't follow it. Amazing how fast things grow back, Caleb said, holding a branch aside so I could pass. Nature doesn't wait for you to come back, I said, then immediately regretted how that sounded. But if Caleb heard any accusation in my words, he didn't show it. The clearing at the top of the hill was smaller than I remembered, but the view was exactly the same. Rolling hills stretched out in all directions, dotted with farmhouses and silos and the occasional church steeple. Our town was visible in the distance, a cluster of buildings and streets that looked almost toy-like from this height. We settled onto the flat rock that had always been our preferred spot, close enough that I could feel the warmth from his body, but not quite touching. For a while, we just sat in comfortable silence, drinking our coffee and watching the world spread out below us. I used to come up here in my dreams, Caleb said eventually, when I needed to remember what home looked like. Must have been hard being so far away. The distance wasn't the hard part, he said. The hard part was not knowing if this would still be here when I got back, if you would still be here. The words settled between us with surprising weight. I turned to look at him, trying to read the expression on his face, but he was still staring out at the valley below. Where else would I be? I asked. I don't know. Married? Moved away? Living some life that didn't have space for the kid who used to climb hills with the neighbor boy? There was something so raw in his voice that it made my chest tighten. I thought about the assumptions he must have made during the years we didn't talk, the stories he must have told himself about what my life looked like without him in it. I dated, I said finally. A few people over the years. Nothing serious. Why not? The question hung in the air between us, and I felt the familiar weight of truth pressing against my ribs. How do you explain that every relationship feels like a shadow of something else? That you can't stop comparing everyone you meet to a memory of the boy who used to know you better than you knew yourself? Hard to find someone who fits, I said, which was true, but not the whole truth. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, then, did you ever think about that night? I knew immediately which night he meant. The one that had been living in the space between us for 4 years, the one we'd danced around in every conversation since he'd been back. Which part? I asked, stalling for time. All of it. The drive out to the lake, the way we sat in the truck for 2 hours just talking, the way it felt when we... He trailed off, but I could finish the sentence in my head. The way it felt when we almost kissed, the way the air had gotten thick between us, the way we'd both leaned in and then pulled back at the last second, too scared of what it might mean. It's the one I never forgot, I said quietly. He turned to look at me then, and there was something in his expression that reminded me of that night. The same intensity, the same sense of standing on the edge of something that could change everything. I've thought about it every day for 4 years, he said. Thought about what might have happened if we hadn't been such cowards. We weren't cowards. We were 17. Same thing sometimes. I laughed despite myself because it was true. At 17, everything feels impossibly important and impossibly fragile at the same time. The stakes feel too high to take risks, even when, especially when, those risks might lead to something beautiful. What would you do differently? I asked. If you could go back. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. I would have kissed you, he said. And then I would have told you that I was in love with you, and I would have asked you to wait for me. The words hit me like a physical thing, stealing the air from my lungs and making my heart race in my chest. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said, trying to reconcile it with everything I'd believed about that night. You were in love with me? I thought you knew, he said, and there was something almost apologetic in his voice. I thought I was being obvious. I stopped, shook my head. I thought I was the only one. The only one what? The only one who felt like that. The silence that followed was different from all the others we'd shared. It wasn't comfortable or awkward or charged with possibility. It was stunned. The kind of silence that follows a revelation so significant it requires a complete recalibration of everything you thought you understood. 4 years, Caleb said finally. 4 years we could have... Don't, I said, because that way led to madness. We can't change what happened. But we can change what happens next. The words hung in the air between us, an invitation and a challenge and a promise all rolled into one. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just the man he'd become, but the boy I'd loved in secret, the friend I'd missed every day he was gone, the possibility I'd never quite been able to let go of. I stayed, I said suddenly, the words coming out before I'd fully formed the thought. What? You asked why I never left town, why I never found someone who fit. I stayed because you were part of this place for me, because leaving would have meant giving up the last connection to what we used to be. I could see him processing this, see the way my words were reshaping his understanding of the past 4 years. What did it cost you? He asked. The question was gentle but unflinching, and I appreciated that he didn't try to make it easier for me to answer. He wanted the truth, even when the truth was complicated and painful. Loneliness, I said. The feeling that I was living half a life, waiting for something that might never come back. The fear that I was holding on to something that only existed in my memory. And now? I looked out at the valley below us, at the town where we'd both grown up and learned to become ourselves. Then I looked at Caleb sitting close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough that I could reach out and touch him if I had the courage. Now I think maybe some things are worth waiting for, I said. The words seemed to release something in him. I watched as the careful control he'd been maintaining since he came home finally cracked, revealing something raw and hopeful and vulnerable underneath. We could try again, he said quietly. We never really started. Then maybe it's time. I felt the truth of it settle in my chest like something warm and bright. Not the desperate, grasping feeling of wanting to recapture the past, but the steady, grounded feeling of possibility opening up in front of us. Without thinking about it, I shifted closer to him on the rock, close enough that our shoulders touched. It was a small movement, but it felt enormous in the context of everything we just shared. He leaned into the contact, and for a while we just sat there, touching at the shoulder and looking out at the world we'd both left and come back to in different ways. It wasn't a kiss or a declaration or any of the dramatic gestures that mark the turning points in love stories, but it was a beginning. A recognition that whatever we'd been to each other before, whatever we might become, there was something worth exploring in the space between us. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon when we finally made our way back down the hill, picking our way carefully through the overgrown path. We didn't talk much during the hike down, but the silence felt different now, expectant, like we were both holding our breath for what came next. When we reached Caleb's truck, he paused with his hand on the door handle. "Jesse," he said, and there was something nervous in his voice that reminded me of the boy who used to practice asking girls to dances in front of his bedroom mirror. "Yeah? This thing we're starting. I need you to know that I'm not the same person who left. There are things about me now that are difficult, complicated." I thought about the way he startled at sudden noises, the way he seemed to catalog exits whenever he entered a room, the careful way he moved through the world like he was always prepared for something to go wrong. "I'm not the same person either," I said. "We'll figure it out together." "You say that like it's easy." "I say it because it's true." He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing my words, trying to decide if he could believe them. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay." The drive back to my house passed in comfortable quiet, the kind of silence that comes after important things have been said and decided. When Caleb pulled into my driveway, I found myself reluctant to get out of the truck, reluctant to let this day end and return to the ordinary world of Monday morning and hardware store responsibilities. "Thank you," I said. "For today, for telling me about that night, for coming back, for staying long enough to figure this out." Something soft and grateful passed across his expression. "Thank you for waiting." I got out of the truck and stood in my driveway, watching him drive away through the gathering dusk. As his taillights disappeared around the corner, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the bone-deep certainty that whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. The next few days passed in a haze of anticipation and normalcy. I went to work, helped customers, organized inventory, closed up shop each evening. The rhythms of my life remained unchanged, but everything felt different somehow, charged with possibility, like I was living in the moment before lightning strikes. Caleb stopped by the store twice, once to buy sandpaper for a project he was working on at his parents' house, once just to talk. Both visits were brief and ordinary on the surface, but underneath I could feel the current of what had changed between us on the hill. We were careful with each other in the way people are when something precious is beginning to grow, when you're not sure how much weight it can bear. We didn't talk about the future or define what was happening between us, but there were small moments, the way his fingers brushed mine when I handed him his receipt, the way he lingered in the store even after his business was finished, the way we looked at each other when we thought the other wasn't watching, that spoke louder than words. On Thursday evening, I was on my front porch with a beer and the book I'd been failing to read for the past week when Caleb's truck pulled into my driveway. He got out with the easy confidence of someone who knew he was welcome, and I felt that familiar flutter of anticipation in my chest. "Good book?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. Couldn't tell you. Haven't made it past page 50. Distracted? Something like that. He smiled, and I was struck again by how different his smiles were now. More deliberate, more precious for being less frequent. When he smiled like this, soft and genuine, and just for me, it reminded me of the boy I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset behind the trees across the street. The evening was warm and still, heavy with the promise of summer, and I found myself thinking about all the evenings we'd spent like this when we were younger, talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that had seemed so natural then and felt like a minor miracle now. I've been thinking about what you said, Caleb said eventually, about figuring things out together. What about it? I want you to know what you're signing up for, he said, and there was something careful in his voice that made me look at him more closely. I meant what I said about being different now, complicated. Show me, I said. He turned to look at me, surprise flickering across his expression. What? Whatever it is you think I can't handle, whatever parts of yourself you think are too difficult or complicated, show me. Let me decide for myself. For a moment, I thought he was going to deflect, make some joke to lighten the mood and change the subject. But then something shifted in his expression, some wall coming down. I have nightmares, he said quietly, almost every night. Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm still over there, still in danger. Sometimes I can't tell the difference between what's real and what's in my head. The words were spoken so quietly I had to lean closer to hear them, and I could see what the admission cost him, the vulnerability of sharing something so personal, so frightening. Okay, I said. Okay? Okay, you have nightmares. What else? He stared at me for a moment like he couldn't quite believe my reaction. Then slowly he continued. I can't be in crowds for very long without feeling like I need to escape. Loud noises make me jump. I have to check the locks on my doors 3 times before I can sleep, and even then I wake up every few hours to check them again. With each confession, I could see him bracing himself for my reaction, waiting for me to decide it was too much, too complicated, too difficult to deal with. But all I felt was a fierce protectiveness, a desire to stand between him and whatever was causing him pain. Anything else? I asked. Sometimes I forget where I am, he said, and his voice was barely more than a whisper now. Sometimes I'm sitting at the kitchen table having breakfast with my parents and suddenly I can't remember how I got there, can't remember what year it is or what I'm supposed to be doing. It's like there's this disconnect between who I was and who I am now, and I get lost in the space between them. The words hung in the evening air between us, raw and honest and painful. I could see him waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to decide whether the broken parts of himself were too much for whatever we were building together. Instead of answering with words, I reached over and took his hand. His fingers were rough and warm, scarred in ways they hadn't been before, but they fit against mine the same way they always had. Thank you, I said, for trusting me with that. That's it? He sounded almost disbelieving. That's your reaction? What did you expect? I don't know. Pity, maybe. Or fear, or you deciding this is too complicated to deal with. I thought about how to explain that the things he'd just shared with me weren't complications or obstacles, they were just parts of who he was now. That loving someone, really loving them, meant accepting all of them. Justiciaos. Macht?